Dear colleagues and friends of Christian archaeology, in a couple of days, on 2nd of September, the 18th International Congress of Christian Archaeology will be opened in Belgrade in Serbia. As rector of the Pontifical Institute of Christian Archaeology, I'm honored of having been assigned the task of holding the inaugural lecture of this Congress, which bears the title Early Christianity Between Liturgical Practice and Everyday Life. To date, all previous congresses concerning the Christian archaeological field have published the lectures provided by their participants. All these files represent a huge wealth of knowledge, over 20,000 pages, and adding them to a database would represent a huge step forward. These files would conceal millions of significant insights. However, even without such a database, it can be said that the history of the congresses proves how archaeological science has constantly accepted and overcome new challenges. It is not only today that the archaeological science is changing rapidly as a result of technical innovations and has to reinvent itself in many ways. These congresses should therefore also represent a fair for ideas and innovations and should make this field attractive and sustainable. Material objects represent the primary focus of research for Christian archaeology. Archaeology as a science asked itself, what have we uncovered and removed from the dust of time? What have we excavated? What is the actual shape of these objects? What kind of context do they belong to? It was always the task of archaeology to produce catalogues and corpora of the various objects in order to gather things together, to compare, to analyze, and finally to interpret them. Unfortunately, many objects don't present the original context of the discoveries, which leads them to remain without a history. On the other hand, the portion of objects whose origin and context are known is constantly increasing. Actually, one of the resolutions of the very first Congress in Split in 1894 was to produce such corpora. Joseph Wilpert alone collected 3 such corpora, printing them in folio format. This tradition continues today, even though it is now done through important databases. For instance, within the fields of architecture we have CARE, of epigraphy we have EAGLE, and in the fields of numismatics and ceramics are other databases to be found. All these corpora and databases teach us archaeology is a sustainable science and teaches students to appreciate sustainability. For the archaeologist, even the smallest detail is significant because it contains the message of a lost era whose memory must be preserved. The modern behavior of consuming and throwing things away is absolutely alien to archaeological ethics. For us, the resources of memory are not inexhaustible. They must be recovered and carefully preserved so that they can be available to future generations as well. This care for things of the past is the true quality of the archaeologist. And it should also be noted that through modern technology, more and more information can be obtained from our findings. What was once considered worthless may now contribute significant notions. Anyway, databases and catalogues must be brought to life. No matter how extensive the information on the objects is, if the life context of these objects is not properly addressed, it remains sterile and ultimately buried in a USB flash drive, failing to engage the public and a cultural audience. We should not leave it to historians alone to set free the stories contained in the objects. We should not limit ourselves to merely collecting material, thus reducing archaeology to an auxiliary science. Otherwise, we deprive ourselves of the impact and fascination of archaeological research. The questions that arise when considering the findings are: what do the objects tell us about people from different regions and times? What kind of significance and what impact did these items have on people's life? And on the other hand, how does daily life change what goes through people's mind when they surround themselves with such objects and things, when they use these objects, or when they merely see and perceive them? During the 12th International Congress of Christian Archaeology, held in Bonn in 1991, my predecessor, Monsignor Victor Saxer, stated that the goal of Christian archaeology is to gain, quotation, a concrete image of Christian life far from theories and speculations, end of quotation. He deliberately spoke about a concrete image of Christian life, fully aware that this Christian life does not exist as an isolated object, but only as an interactive dimension of late antique society. Nevertheless, it must be noted that the expression Christian archaeology not only represents a chronological definition, but defines the content as well, namely the history of Christianity. Dealing with early Christianity will make this discipline, I'm sure about that, a science of the future. We live indeed in an era of increasing interest towards religion and towards Christianity in particular. At the same time, however, Christian practice as well as knowledge disappear. Therefore, there is a real ever-growing need for experts who can save us from the voracious chronos, from the time which devours everything so that we forget everything. Such experts in history are precisely trained in Christian archaeology. Christian archaeology is a science encompassing life, society and culture. It is not limited to the study of Christian monuments or artifacts that were presumably used by Christians and non-Christians, nor is it confined to the touchable objects or to everything which can be measured and photographed. It is also interested in life itself, primarily in Christians' life, which is then to be contextualized within the late antique and early medieval society in its entirety. How should we imagine life, for example, in a fortress like Naissus, in an episcopal city like Justiniana Prima, in an imperial city, in a harbor city, in a pilgrimage city, or finally in a religiously or confessionally mixed one? What was daily life in rural areas, in woods and deserts, on mountains and islands, in times of war and peace, in theaters and in baths, in archives and libraries, across any kind of profession, and not least during festivities in churches and monasteries? These are all fascinating questions that rouse our curiosity and require meticulous research to approach the totality of life as closely as possible. Since the Pontifical Institute is responsible, the congresses have thematic accents, but only since the 9th Congress in Rome in 1975 they have an overarching topic that appears explicitly in the title of the proceedings. These topics can be divided into three groups: congresses with a topographical focus, with a chronological approach, and those with a special interest like pilgrimage and so on. Our Congress now in Belgrade is one of the third group with a special interest, which is the liturgical practice and everyday life in early Christianity. This brings us to the theme of this Congress: early Christianity between liturgical practice and everyday life. It's a typical between theme, which has the advantage of being adaptable. On the one hand, it allows for openness, on the other hand, it requires constant focus. It concerns the life of early Christians in its totality, breathing between liturgy and daily life. Liturgy and daily life describe the poles of the ellipse around which Christian life revolves, with the hope that both liturgy and life are not separate worlds and ultimately form a dynamic and tension-filled unity within the lives of Christians. This Congress will therefore address liturgy and daily life, but it will also examine how both poles are interconnected. 40 years ago, the aforementioned Victor Saxer published his PhD thesis titled Vie liturgique et quotidienne à Carthage vers le milieu du IIIe siècle, which is almost a programmatic statement for this Congress. Vie liturgique et quotidienne, liturgical life and daily life. Any theory that perceives the essence of Christianity as being merely rooted in ethics or in worship is not grasping its reality. It was only the secularization and the idealism of the 18th and 19th centuries that led to a dichotomy between everyday life and worship, between society and liturgy. In contrast, from the very beginning, Christianity has claimed that baptism entails a complete transformation of one's way of life, thus naturally triggering a dynamic that leads to a new culture of life and society. This is already evident in the two ways doctrine of the Didache. Even more clearly, the church order of the apostolic tradition from the early 3rd century reveals how deeply intertwined everyday life and worship were in Syria, how the ecclesiastical regulations penetrated the daily life of Christians, and to what extent family and communal life were ritualized. The theme of our Congress can be described as the mechanism behind the inculturation of Christianity. Christianity establishes itself within the existing culture and, from a certain point, significantly shapes it, allowing one to speak of a Christian culture. Charles Pietri already addressed this at the 11th International Congress of Christian Archeology in Lyon in 1986, referring to la christianisation de la vie quotidienne. It concerns the emergence of Christian culture. It spans from the 0 point, the Christ event and the beginning of Christian preaching, to the moment when religious practice becomes simply daily life. At some point, Christian codes and codices become a cultural factor, permeating the entire society to such an extent that even non-Christians are affected. We arrive at a crucial point that distinguishes Christianity from the older religions. Christian Gnilka refers to cultural transformation as a distinguishing mark of Christianity. Neither ancient philosophy nor polytheistic worship aimed at a cultural conversion. Philosophy addressed only an elite, and polytheistic worship lacked an ethical framework. However, for Christianity, both the Old and New Testament function as a law, as ethics, a doctrine of virtue that does not remain within the purely religious sphere, but encompasses and transforms the entire culture. This transformation emanates from Christian worship itself, as Augustine notes, stating that the law of Christ is proclaimed from the elevated place within the church building, that is, from the ambo. Sancta scriptura justitieque doctrina de superiore loco in conspectu omnium personante. The cultural historical approach of Christian archaeology leaves apologetics behind. The focus is not on presenting an idealized version of the Christian mission, but on verifying and specifying what actually occurred. In this context, the complementarity of literal and material sources plays a crucial role. Material sources can provide a form of counter-evidence to literal testimonies, which often have the tendency for glorification. Archaeological evidence stands as a source in its own right, frequently revealing aspects of history that are otherwise unknown. However, it would be naive to believe that archaeological findings are so unequivocal that they can supersede written sources. Archaeological discoveries often raise more questions than the written sources have already addressed. A cultural historical approach is essential to Christian archaeology. I believe that the field of Christian archaeology remains relevant only if it discovers its historiographical dimension. And learns how to narrate the lives of early Christians between religion and everyday life more effectively. This is essentially a commonplace observation. Every museologist knows that nowadays objects are no longer displayed in neat rows behind glass cases, but must be used to tell stories through selected items. The immense reconstructive work involved in this is the task of Christian archaeologists. Ultimately, it must result in a narrative. The most successful promotional campaign of Christian archaeology was the narrative of the catacomb church, the Church of the Catacombs. Never was there such interest in Christian archaeology as during Giovanni Battista de' Rossi's time during the 19th century, because at that time they succeeded in creating a narrative starting from the catacombs. By framing this Congress around the theme of between liturgy and everyday life, we are providing material for a new narrative, which will be, hopefully, as attractive as the old one. Ultimately, Christian archaeology must concern itself with the totality of Christian life, and that is precisely the focus of this Congress. Christian life between everyday existence and liturgy. I would like to mention now, concluding, a few keywords regarding these transitions between everyday life and liturgy in late antique society, which are apt to trigger further chains of association. In all these transitions, archaeology plays a crucial role. A primary transition existed between the temporal and the eternal. Nothing is simultaneously as mundane and as religious as death. Through the act of dying, the trivial and the spiritual converge. thousands of burial sites turn into thousands of centers of remembrance and for the ritualization of memory. Graves act as a reservoir of memory. Here, transformations in social and religious self-understanding can be discerned through the epigraphic or iconographic representation of the deceased. Consider the titles, professional designations and attributes, as well as the entire visual art. Even seemingly banal details like hairstyles provide a link to fashion-driven everyday life. The transformation of burial culture is an example case of how the entire reality of the dead crystallizes into the worship of the living. Iconography in funerary context changed fundamentally. Members of the upper class began to appear more frequently in epitaphs and employ Christian imagery. The Christian inversion of values corresponds to the shift of worship from the city of the living to cemeteries, which become the new cities of the living. Cemeteries thus become sites of celebration and resurrection. Who, if not archaeology, can so clearly demonstrate this inversion of values described by Peter Braun? A second transition existed between the sacred and the secular sphere. These two domains can only be understood through their distinction on the one hand side and relation on the other hand side. Early Christian church architecture cannot be understood without acknowledging this invisible threshold. It is, in my view, incorrect to assume that Christians regarded their gathering spaces as secular until the time of Constantine. Rather, these spaces were special, designated for worshipping, holy places to encounter with God. However, the faithful also appropriated these spaces, using them for their own daily purposes. There are churches with fountains, healing baths, incubation rooms, tombs, graffiti walls and votive tablets. All archaeological evidence of the, so to speak, everyday appropriation of church space by the faithful. Later, there was also the appropriation of church space by rulers. Consider the imperial images in San Vitale in Ravenna, where Justinian and Theodora were depicted in the liturgical act of the offertory, and through these images situated themselves as lay people within the sacred space of presbytery. This also involves the question of the social implications of liturgy. In the same church space, people from the city of all ethnic and social strata came together. Unity and differentiation converged here, which must have had significant impacts on daily life and social structures. Church spaces reflected the social order, as they were not unstructured but assigned specific places to different groups, to clergy, widows, virgins, nobility, men and women, catacombs and penitents. In this context, social boundaries were sometimes adjusted in favor of Christian freedom. For instance, Bishop Calixtus of Rome allowed marriages between Christian aristocratic women and Christian men of lower status. At the same time, there was a leveling effect. Sin is found in all social ranks. Penitents had to wait outside the church, where aristocrats and slaves would likely find themselves together in the atrium. Society was being restructured, and this became particularly visible in the liturgy. One should not overlook the significance of the baptistry as a symbol of urban unity. Since the Middle Ages, we know the importance of baptism in the process of nation building. The interplay between the sacred and the secular also encompasses the residential context of sacred buildings. Churches do not exist in isolation. The description of a standard church in the Testamentum Domini Nostri Jesu Christi from the 5th century is paradigmatic in this regard, as it includes not only the basilica and the baptistery, but also a number of additional utility and residential rooms. Libraries and sacristies often become associated with churches evolving into centers of church administration. Additionally, treasuries are established to store not only liturgical vessels, but also to manage the church's wealth. When liturgical assemblies occur multiple times a day, there is a tendency for residences to be located close to the church. This phenomenon can also be observed in monastic context. Similar cases include palace churches. For instance, in Santa Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, a large mosaic within the church originally depicted Theodoric and his court establishing a visible connection to the palace. The episcopal administration expanded as bishops took on more civil and military responsibilities. Bishops required audience halls, which were used for jurisdiction and simultaneously for the administration of the sacraments. Additionally, episcopal ethics included providing free lodging to guests and pilgrims, leading to the development of hotel services near churches, ensuring that pilgrims could participate in liturgy. Large festivals or synods stimulated significant economic activity, as they also attracted the rural population. Paulinus of Nola installed images in the church to engage the rural people when it comes for the feast day of Saint Felix, ensuring that they would forget their hunger and thirst while viewing the images, in line with the saying, less drinking, more miracles. Less pocula, more miracula. A third transition led from worship to charity. Individual and social distress create imbalances in every society, and state welfare was almost non-existent, being barely developed even during the imperial period. Christianity fostered a strong sense of social responsibility. This Christian collectivism originated notably in worship, specifically in the collection of alms. The common worship of all Christian inhabitants of a city led to the accumulation of funds which could then be used to aid the poor. The common worship across all social and economic strata fostered a solidarity that was religiously motivated. While there were certainly poor individuals that needed aid, they weren't so many that funds could not also be used for church buildings and art. Furthermore, storage rooms for the offerings of the faithful were found inside or near churches, along with offertory boxes, wells and other facilities for supplies and hygiene. There were also hospices for the homeless and pilgrims. The link between worship and charity becomes particularly evident at pilgrimage sites, which developed into substantial healthcare and welfare institutions. A fourth transition led from the church to the street. This concerns the topography of the city, as the liturgy was brought to the streets in various forms of station liturgy, as seen in Jerusalem, Constantinople or Rome. The multitude of churches, both within and outside the city, transformed and reconstructed the urban and suburban areas. The public space become Christianized. In archaeological research, church complexes are initially examined in isolation, but historically they were not isolated. They were likely interconnected administratively, personnel-wise and liturgically. For instance, in Justinia Prima, one might question the purpose of the numerous churches within the city. It seems inconceivable that these churches operated entirely independently. Thus, it is almost certain that there was a coordinated and integrated liturgical practice among them. Episcopal churches have their satellite churches, resulting in a network that extends inside the public space. Here the everyday life and worship intersected directly. In Rome, for instance, the Pope received on his way to the station church petitions and complaints, presenting himself as a judge of the people. His role as a judge was inseparable from the liturgy, which he was about to celebrate, and which can also be viewed as a manifestation of the divine judge Christ. In any case, liturgy pushed its way into the public space. Urban planning had to accommodate this. Church spaces communicated with the city and served as a backdrop. The most prominent locations, the highest elevations within the city or the landscape, were dedicated to sacred buildings. Cities acquired an increasingly recognizable religious profile. This included monuments, towers, crosses, inscriptions, public squares, and covered processional routes. A fifth transition led, in a sense, outside the world. Monasticism established a wholly distinct daily life that cannot be compared with ordinary social life. This type of life was permeated in a unique manner by liturgy. The ways in which ascetics lived according to various rules and interacted with people in both urban and rural settings are subjects that archaeology is well suited to investigate. Archaeology alone can capture the dispersion of monastic settlements and their management of daily life under specific regional conditions. For example, it is important to distinguish between rural and urban monasteries. Rural communities operated economic enterprises and produced goods such as wine that weren't limited to liturgical use. Let me conclude with a few more aspects of our Congress theme. There are everyday practices that migrated to liturgy, including hand washing, sign of peace, the mixing of wine with water, as well as seemingly trivial matters such as filtering wine and driving away flies using a flabellum. Various forms of drinking containers and bowls were required by the liturgy, and it did not take long for preferred shapes to emerge. There has been considerable debate over the possible use of sigma-shaped tables as altars. Objects used in both everyday and sacred contexts also include oil lamps and incense burners. A classic example of the intersection between worship and daily life is the clothing of clerics, which is the subject of ongoing debate regarding when specific and exclusive liturgical garments emerged. Another topic is the agape, a common meal held by a bishop. Although these were not liturgies per se, they were ritualized acts of interaction. There existed a genuine grey area between liturgy and everyday life during these events. From Roman liturgy we know that in the Middle Ages the Pope invited during Mass certain individuals to dinner that took place afterwards in his palace. Another case is that of funeral banquets. And indeed, such banquets were associated with rites which transformed in a certain way everyday practices into liturgy of the dead. Finally, the matter of Christian sacrifice is of enormous relevance for the topic of everyday life and liturgy. Bread and wine, natural offerings as opposed to animal sacrifices. The persistent protest by preachers from Paul to Augustine against the meat of idol sacrifices branded meat as forbidden, leading to the establishment of a vegetarian diet within Christianity, with notable consequences for animal farming and agriculture. Monasteries in particular insisted on a radical abstention from meat. Vegetable products rather than animals were brought by the faithful to the services. These offerings were sanctified through the priest's blessing. The offering procession offertory of the faithful was a key interface between everyday life and worship. The faithful desired to carry and retain the sacred within their everyday life. They transported the Eucharist to their homes in pyxes and preserved it there. They took holy water from the baptistry to sprinkle on their homes and fields. They also acquired relics and holy souvenirs and equipped chapels in their honor. Dear friends, I hope these first insights may have been helpful for you. Thank you for your patience and attention.